Something is wrong, not with the situation, but with what is not being said. Because when someone feels nothing, it is simple, clean, obvious. They leave or they stay without weight. But when someone feels everything and says nothing, the air becomes heavy. Their silence begins to speak louder than words ever could. And here is the strange truth. The deepest emotions often hide behind the strongest restraint. What you are about to recognize are not obvious signs. These are not the loud confessions or dramatic gestures people are taught to expect. These are quieter, almost invisible patterns, the kind that only reveal themselves when you stop listening to words and start observing the contradictions. Because the human psyche does not lie, it only disguises. You may notice moments where the energy shifts for no clear reason, a sudden distance after closeness, a hesitation where ease once existed. This is not indifference. This is inner conflict, a silent negotiation between desire and fear. And when someone is fighting themselves, their behavior becomes inconsistent, not because they do not feel, but because they feel too much and do not know how to hold it. Pay attention to what is remembered, small details, passing comments, things even you have forgotten. When these return to you through them, it reveals something deeper than casual attention. It shows that somewhere beneath the surface, your presence has been carefully stored, almost protected. But here is where it becomes more complex. Instead of moving closer, there may be moments of withdrawal, a step back just when connection begins to deepen. This is where most people misunderstand. They assume distance means disinterest. But psychologically, distance can also be a defense. To feel deeply is to risk losing control, and not everyone is ready for that. There may also be a quiet form of jealousy, not expressed through words, not even acknowledged directly. It appears in subtle tension, in shifts of tone, in moments where something unspoken lingers. This is not ownership. It is the shadow of attachment trying to remain hidden, and despite all attempts to create space, there is a pattern that repeats itself, a return, again and again, not always physically, but mentally, emotionally, as if something unresolved continues to pull them back, even when logic suggests otherwise. This is not coincidence. Emotional restraint, when it appears on the surface, often gets misunderstood as a lack of feeling. But psychologically, it can represent the exact opposite. It can signal the presence of something so intense that the individual does not feel fully equipped to express it. In the framework of depth psychology, this restraint is not accidental. It is a defense mechanism, a form of inner regulation designed to maintain stability in the face of overwhelming emotion. When a person begins to feel deeply, especially in a way that threatens their sense of control or identity, the psyche responds by creating distance between the feeling and its expression. This is not a conscious decision. It happens beneath awareness. The individual may not even fully understand why they are holding back. They only experience a subtle tension, a pressure that builds whenever the emotion tries to move outward. What makes this dynamic complex is that the feeling continues to grow internally. It does not fade simply because it is not expressed. In fact, it can become stronger precisely because it is being held in. The energy that would normally be released through words or actions turns inward. It deepens, becoming more concentrated, more significant. This is why restrained emotion often carries a sense of weight. It is dense with meaning, even if it remains unspoken. From the outside, this can create confusion. The person may appear calm, composed, even indifferent. Their words may not match the subtle shifts in their behavior. There may be moments where their attention lingers longer than necessary, where their presence feels more intentional than casual interaction would require. These are small leaks in the structure of restraint, moments where the underlying emotion briefly becomes visible. At the same time, the individual may avoid situations that would force expression. They might change the subject when conversations move toward emotional territory. They might withdraw slightly after moments of closeness. This is not because the closeness is unwelcome, but because it intensifies the internal experience to a point where maintaining control becomes more difficult. The withdrawal serves to restore balance, to reduce the pressure that builds when the feeling comes too close to the surface. There is also an internal conflict that accompanies this restraint. On one side, there is the desire to move toward the connection, to express, to make the feeling known. On the other side, there is the fear of what that expression might lead to: loss of control, rejection, exposure of vulnerability. These opposing forces create a push and pull within the psyche, and the result is often inconsistency in behavior. This is why emotional restraint should not be interpreted at face value. It is not simply silence, it is structured silence, shaped by past experience, internal conflict, and the intensity of what is being held back. It is an active process, not a passive absence. Inconsistent behavior, when viewed superficially, is often labeled as confusion, indecision, or lack of seriousness. But at a deeper psychological level, it frequently reflects an internal conflict that has not yet been resolved. It is not randomness. It is a pattern shaped by opposing forces within the psyche, each pulling in a different direction. When a person begins to feel something significant, especially something that challenges their habitual sense of control, two systems activate simultaneously. One moves toward connection, driven by emotional attraction, curiosity, and the natural human inclination to bond. The other moves away, driven by caution, self-protection, and the anticipation of potential emotional risk. These two forces do not operate in harmony. They alternate in dominance, creating behavior that appears unpredictable from the outside. This is why there can be moments of genuine warmth followed by unexpected distance. The warmth is not an act, and the distance is not a sudden loss of feeling. Each moment is real, but each is governed by a different internal state. When the desire for connection is stronger, the person becomes more open, more engaged, more present. When the protective system takes over, there is a withdrawal, a shift in tone, a subtle closing off. What makes this dynamic particularly complex is that the individual themselves may not fully understand these shifts. They are not consciously deciding to be inconsistent. Instead, they are responding to internal signals that arise automatically. One moment they feel safe enough to move closer, and in the next, something internal signals that they have gone too far, too fast, or too deep. The result is a kind of emotional oscillation. This oscillation often becomes more noticeable as the connection deepens. In the early stages, interactions may feel relatively stable because the emotional stakes are still low, but as significance increases, so does the intensity of the internal conflict. The closer the connection moves towards something meaningful, the stronger the protective response becomes. It is not the absence of feeling that creates distance, but the presence of feeling that feels difficult to manage. There are also subtle behavioral markers within this inconsistency. The person may initiate contact and then become less responsive. They may express interest indirectly through attention or presence, and then avoid direct acknowledgement of that interest. Their communication may fluctuate, not in a chaotic way, but in a patterned rhythm that reflects the ongoing push and pull within them. From a depth psychology perspective, this can be understood as the tension between the conscious self and the shadow. The conscious self seeks to maintain order, predictability, and control, while the shadow carries impulses, desires, and fears that have not been fully integrated. When a strong emotional experience activates the shadow, it disrupts the usual balance. The person is no longer acting from a single unified center, but from multiple competing influences. This is why inconsistency should not be immediately interpreted as disinterest or manipulation. It often indicates that something meaningful is present, but not yet fully processed or accepted internally. The behavior is fragmented because the internal state is fragmented, divided between moving forward and holding back at the same time. Subtle attention to detail is one of the most revealing yet easily overlooked psychological signals of deep emotional investment. On the surface, it may appear insignificant, almost accidental. Remembering a passing comment, noticing a slight change in tone, recalling a preference that was mentioned only once. These actions do not demand attention in the way grand gestures do, yet they carry a different kind of weight. They indicate that the mind has been quietly organizing information around a specific person in a way that goes beyond casual interaction. In ordinary social exchanges, most information is filtered out. The brain naturally prioritizes what is immediately useful and discards the rest. This is a function of efficiency. However, when someone becomes emotionally significant, this filtering process changes. The mind begins to assign value to details that would otherwise be considered irrelevant. Small pieces of information are retained, not because they serve a practical purpose, but because they are connected to the presence of that person. This shift is largely unconscious. The individual is not deliberately choosing to remember these details in a calculated way. Instead, their attention has been subtly reoriented. What was once neutral becomes meaningful. A simple preference, a habit, a minor reaction, all of these are stored with surprising clarity. This happens because emotional relevance enhances memory encoding. The stronger the internal response, the more deeply the associated details are embedded. What makes this particularly significant is that this attention often remains unspoken. It does not present itself as direct acknowledgement. Instead, it reveals itself indirectly, through actions and moments that seem almost coincidental. A topic is brought up that aligns with something mentioned long ago. A small need is anticipated without being expressed. There is a sense of being quietly observed, not in an intrusive way, but in a manner that suggests genuine awareness. This kind of attention requires mental presence. It means that even when there is no immediate interaction, the person continues to occupy space in the individual's internal world. Their words, behaviors, and characteristics are revisited, processed, and integrated. This ongoing mental engagement is not typical of superficial interest. It reflects a deeper level of cognitive and emotional involvement. At the same time, there is often a contrast between this attentiveness and the individual's outward behavior. They may not openly express their feelings or intentions. In fact, they may appear reserved or even detached in certain situations. Yet this quiet observation continues in the background. The restraint in expression does not diminish the intensity of attention. If anything, it can amplify it, because the energy that would have been directed outward is instead channeled inward into perception and memory. There is also a protective element to this behavior. By focusing on details rather than declarations, the individual maintains a level of control. They can engage with the connection without fully exposing themselves. It allows them to remain close while still preserving a sense of safety. The attention becomes a form of participation that does not require vulnerability in the conventional sense. This is why such details should not be dismissed as trivial. They are not random observations. They are traces of an internal process in which someone has become significant enough to reshape the way attention operates. The mind does not invest this level of precision without reason. It reflects a quiet but consistent orientation towards someone who has begun to matter in a way that is not yet openly expressed. Protective distance is one of the most paradoxical expressions of emotional investment because it appears, on the surface, to contradict the very idea of closeness. Distance is usually interpreted as disinterest, avoidance, or detachment. Yet in many psychological cases, especially where emotions are intense but unintegrated, distance is not the absence of feeling, but a strategy for managing it. When someone begins to experience a connection that feels significant, it can disrupt their internal equilibrium. Emotional closeness reduces the sense of control the individual has over themselves. It introduces unpredictability, dependence, and the possibility of loss. For a psyche that is accustomed to stability through self-containment, this can feel threatening. The response is not to eliminate the connection, but to regulate its intensity. Distance becomes a tool for that regulation. This kind of distance is not random or absolute. It tends to appear at specific moments, particularly when the connection begins to deepen or move toward greater emotional exposure. Just as a conversation becomes more personal, or a moment becomes more intimate, there is a subtle shift. The individual may withdraw slightly, change their tone, or create space where there was previously closeness. This shift is not a rejection of the moment itself, but a response to the internal pressure it creates. Psychologically, this can be understood as a boundary formed not against the other person, but against one's own emotional overflow. The individual senses, often unconsciously, that they are approaching a level of vulnerability they are not prepared to handle. Rather than allowing themselves to cross that threshold, they step back. The distance is protective, but it is self-protection rather than a statement about the value of the connection. There is also an element of preservation in this behavior. When something begins to matter deeply, the fear of losing it increases. This fear does not always manifest as clinging or overt attachment. In some personalities, it produces the opposite effect. By maintaining distance, the individual attempts to reduce the stakes. If they are not fully immersed, they believe they will not be fully affected by potential loss. It is a way of keeping the emotional experience within manageable limits. At the same time, this distance does not eliminate the connection. The person remains psychologically engaged. They continue to think, observe, and respond, but from a slightly removed position. This creates a dynamic where they are neither fully present nor fully absent. They exist in a controlled proximity, close enough to maintain the connection, but far enough to avoid complete exposure. This behavior can create confusion for the other person because it disrupts the expected pattern of increasing closeness. There may be moments of genuine connection followed by unexpected space without any clear explanation. From the outside, it can seem inconsistent or even contradictory. However, when viewed through a psychological lens, the pattern reveals a consistent internal logic. The closer the connection moves toward emotional depth, the stronger the need for distance becomes. It is also important to recognize that this distance requires effort. It is not a passive state. The individual is actively regulating their behavior, often suppressing impulses to move closer. This suppression indicates that there is something to regulate in the first place. Indifference does not require control. Only significant feeling creates the need for such careful management. In this sense, protective distance is not a void, but a structured space. It is shaped by fear, desire, memory, and the need for self-preservation. It reflects a psyche that is engaged but cautious, involved but guarded, moving toward connection while simultaneously holding itself back. Unspoken jealousy, when it appears in psychological behavior, rarely presents itself in the direct, recognizable form people expect. It does not always involve confrontation, accusations, or visible possessiveness. Instead, it often manifests in silence, withdrawal, subtle shifts in energy, or a sudden cooling of presence. This makes it one of the most misunderstood emotional signals because it hides behind restraint rather than expression. At its core, jealousy is not simply about possession of another person. It is more accurately an emotional response to perceived threat in attachment. When someone begins to feel that a connection they value might be shifting, expanding beyond their control, or being shared in a way that triggers insecurity, the psyche reacts. But not every personality expresses this reaction outwardly. In more restrained or emotionally controlled individuals, the reaction moves inward instead of outward. There is also an internal conflict that accompanies this state. Part of the psyche wants clarity, reassurance, or reconnection. Another part resists expressing this need due to fear of vulnerability or rejection. This creates a psychological stalemate where the emotion is fully experienced but not externally resolved. The result is a quiet tension that lingers beneath interaction. What is particularly revealing is that this form of jealousy often leads to heightened awareness rather than open reaction. The individual becomes more observant, more mentally engaged with details they might otherwise ignore. They may notice changes in behavior more quickly or revisit previous interactions with new interpretation. The emotion does not disappear, it transforms into attention. Over time, this can create a pattern of emotional oscillation. Moments of engagement followed by subtle withdrawal, not as a conscious strategy, but as an unconscious attempt to manage internal discomfort. The jealousy remains unspoken, but it influences rhythm, tone, and presence in ways that are perceptible if one is attentive enough to notice the underlying structure rather than just the surface behavior. Repeated returns, whether physical, conversational, or purely psychological, often carry a meaning far deeper than simple habit or coincidence. When someone keeps coming back to a person, situation, or emotional space despite attempts to distance themselves, it usually signals that something within that connection has not been resolved. The return is not always intentional in the conscious sense. More often, it is an unconscious movement driven by emotional residue that refuses to settle. From a psychological perspective, the mind does not easily abandon what it has emotionally invested in. Even when a person tries to detach, suppress, or redirect their attention, the emotional imprint remains active beneath awareness. This is especially true when the connection has carried intensity, ambiguity, or unresolved tension. The psyche continues to revisit it, almost like a loop that seeks completion but never fully reaches closure. These returns can take different forms. Sometimes they appear as actual re-engagement, such as reinitiating conversation, checking in, or finding reasons to reconnect. Other times, they exist internally as mental revisiting, where the person repeatedly thinks about past interactions, replays conversations, or imagines alternative outcomes. Even silence can be a form of return when the mind keeps circling back to the same emotional point. What makes this pattern significant is its persistence despite resistance. The individual may consciously decide to step away or create distance, believing they are moving on. Yet something pulls them back, not necessarily toward the person directly, but toward the emotional state associated with them. It is less about the external figure and more about the internal activation they represent. The return is, in a sense, a return to a feeling that has not been fully processed. This phenomenon often arises when emotional experiences are layered with contradiction. For example, attraction mixed with fear, closeness mixed with uncertainty, or desire mixed with self-protection. When emotions are clear, the mind can integrate them and move forward. But when they are conflicted, the psyche struggles to organize them into a coherent narrative. As a result, it keeps revisiting the experience, attempting to reinterpret it in a way that feels complete or manageable. Repeated returns also suggest that emotional energy has not been fully discharged. In psychological terms, unexpressed emotion tends to persist. It does not simply disappear because of distance or time. Instead, it remains active in memory and attention, drawing the individual back into reflection or re-engagement. This is why even long gaps in interaction do not always erase the connection. The emotional charge remains stored, waiting for resolution. There is also a subtle tension between control and surrender within this pattern. The individual may attempt to maintain control by stepping away, rationalizing their decision, or convincing themselves that distance is necessary. However, the emotional pull undermines this control, leading to moments of return. These returns can feel almost involuntary, as if something internal overrides conscious intention. Over time, this creates a rhythm of approach and withdrawal. The person moves away to regain stability, then returns when the emotional weight becomes too significant to ignore. Each return is an attempt to re-evaluate, re-experience, or re-establish balance. Yet if the underlying emotional conflict remains unresolved, the cycle continues. What is important to understand is that repeated returns are not random behavior. They are signals of psychological significance. The mind does not repeatedly revisit what is emotionally irrelevant. It returns to what still holds meaning, tension, or unfinished emotional work, even when the individual consciously tries to move beyond it. Quiet prioritization is one of the most understated yet revealing indicators of emotional significance, precisely because it does not announce itself. It does not rely on dramatic gestures, verbal declarations, or socially visible effort. Instead, it appears in small, almost invisible choices that consistently place one person slightly ahead of competing demands. From the outside, it can look ordinary or coincidental, but psychologically it often reflects a deeper internal ordering of value. When someone begins to matter on an emotional level, the mind does not always express this through obvious action. In many cases, especially where restraint or emotional control is strong, the expression shifts into subtle behavioral preference. The person is not necessarily prioritizing consciously in a calculated way. Rather, their attention, time, and responsiveness begin to orient themselves around the presence of that individual without deliberate planning. This can be observed in patterns such as showing up during important moments without being asked, responding at times that suggest attentiveness rather than obligation, or adjusting personal choices in ways that accommodate the other person's presence. These actions may appear small, but their consistency is what gives them psychological weight. It is not the intensity of a single action, but the repetition of minor alignments that reveals underlying significance. Quiet prioritization often exists alongside emotional restraint, which makes it even less visible. The individual may not openly express attachment or importance, and yet their behavior tells a different story. This creates a dual layer of expression: externally, neutrality or calm; internally, a structured preference that guides decisions. The emotional content is not absent. It is simply displaced into behavior rather than language. What makes this phenomenon particularly meaningful is that prioritization requires internal ranking. The mind constantly filters competing demands, obligations, and interests. When someone begins to occupy a higher position within that internal hierarchy, even slightly, it influences behavior in subtle but consistent ways. Other options are not necessarily rejected, but they are weighed differently. The presence of that person becomes a reference point in decision-making. This does not always manifest in large sacrifices or obvious changes. In fact, it is often more visible in what does not happen. Certain opportunities may be passed over without explanation. Certain distractions may be ignored without effort. certain delays may be avoided when they involve the person in question. These absences of hesitation are just as significant as direct action because they reveal an underlying preference structure. At the same time, quiet prioritization often coexists with ambiguity. The individual may not fully acknowledge to themselves why they are making these choices. The emotional significance has not yet been translated into clear self-awareness. It operates instead as an instinctive alignment, where the person simply feels slightly more compelled to act in a certain direction without fully articulating the reason. There is also a protective aspect to this subtle behavior. By keeping prioritization quiet, the individual maintains emotional safety. Openly acknowledging importance can increase vulnerability, create expectations, or expose emotional dependence. By allowing their actions to speak indirectly, they preserve a sense of control while still expressing attachment in a controlled form. Over time, these small patterns accumulate. What begins as occasional adjustment can evolve into consistent preference. The structure of attention slowly reorganizes itself around one presence without overt declaration. This is why quiet prioritization is often only recognized in hindsight, when the pattern becomes too consistent to dismiss as coincidence.